Okay, we're back here again with Hannibal B. Johnson, Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we're going to talk about your books. You had some books that you have produced. How many?
8.
8 books?
8.
And let's look at them here. What do you have?
So, the first couple of books that I want to talk about are books about the Greenwood District, which is a historic African American community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Many people are aware that Tulsa is the site of the worst of the so-called race riots in American history, the 1921 Tulsa race riot. So these books are about that community, and part of the discussion, obviously, is the 1921 Tulsa race riot, which is a really seminal event in the history of the community. And I stress in the history of the community because what's really important is the overall history of the community, the remarkable pioneers who built the community, had that incredible vision, who suffered through the riot, but who were resilient and rebounded and rebuilt the community, which peaked in the early to mid 1940s, subsequently declined in the late 60s and 70s, but is still a part of the city of Tulsa. So Black Wall Street, from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood District, is a historical narrative about that community. The later book, which recently came out, Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, is a photographic narrative history. It's a collection of 200 plus photos with captions and a little bit of text to set the context. But some of these photos are rare and haven't been seen very widely. Both these books are available online. Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, is available at Amazon.com. And the other book, Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, is available at ArcadiaPublishing.com. Arcadia Publishing does a number of these Images of America books all throughout the country on histories of significant American communities.
When did you write this one, Tulsa's Historic?
The latest book came out in early 2014.
So that's your latest book?
Right.
Okay.
Black Wall Street, the original Black Wall Street, the historic narrative, came out in 1998. So it's been out for a while. But people are very, very interested in this book and use it for a variety of things.
What is this book about primarily? This Black Wall Street?
It's about the history of the African American community in Tulsa, called the Greenwood District, which is remarkable in part because these Greenwood pioneers created a remarkable entrepreneurial enclave here in Tulsa, in the black community. The reference to Black Wall Street, or as it was really called, the Negro Wall Street, is a reference to the incredible business and entrepreneurial savvy that existed here in Tulsa in the early part of the 20th century.
And this book chronicles what it was like before, during, and after?
Before the 1921 Tulsa race riot, because the first business was a grocery store started by a fellow named O.W. Gurley, a businessman, in 1905. And the riot occurs, obviously, several years later, in 1921. Comes on the heels of the incredible 26 or so riots that occurred in America in 1919, Red Summer. James Weldon Johnson called it Red Summer. Red, of course, was a reference to, or a metaphor for, the blood that flowed literally in the streets in 1919, summer and fall of 1919. In riots in Omaha, Nebraska, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Longview, Texas, Elaine, Arkansas, really all over the country.
And again, this book here is a pictorial?
Right, it's a photographic narrative, so it has a couple hundred pictures with captions and minimal text, really just to give the book context, give you the summary of the story.
So in other words, I have children in my home, and these are the kind of books we would read together. And what would my kids get out of here?
You certainly could read these together. I have a children's book about the 1921 Tulsa race riot in the Greenwood community called Up from the Ashes. Okay. And so that's written on the 3rd grade reading level. So okay. I just based on that book, I can tell you that young children, 2nd grade and up, can get a number of things out of knowing about this history. They can talk about right and wrong, fair and unfair. They can discuss what it means to live in a community and what respect means in the context of a community. obviously you break the words down to their level, but the concepts, the core concepts that we need to discuss now, and we should have been discussing then, are things that children really do get.
Mm-hmm.
They understand that.
Okay. And next we have
Acres of Aspiration, The All Black Towns in Oklahoma, is a book about the remarkable history in Oklahoma of the founding of all black towns. Primarily between 1890 and 1910, there were more than 50 all black towns founded in Oklahoma. Some of them are known fairly widely throughout the United States, like Boley was the premier all black town according to Booker T. Washington. Langston is the home of Langston University, which is the farthest west of the black colleges. Taft, people might remember Taft because Red Fox adopted Taft in the 1970s, made several visits to Taft, and it was in the papers. And not to be outdone, Flip Wilson adopted Boley and made several visits to Boley. So I remember as a kid seeing in Jet magazine pictures of Flip Wilson and Red Fox adopting those towns, Boley and Taft, respectively.
I noticed here that the foreword was by Michael Eric Dyson. How did that come about?
Dr. Dyson happened to be here for a speaking engagement for Tulsa Public Schools one time. I met him, contacted him. Happened to be working on the book. Talked to him about doing the foreword. Went back and forth. He agreed to do it. He did it. Stand-up guy. He did. He was true to his word. He said he would do it. He did it. That's great.
And so this book came out when?
Came out in about 2002 or so, I believe.
How long did it take you to write this one?
It's hard to say. I mean, all of these books, I don't work on them constantly because I have a business, so I sort of work on these books part-time. I get inspired and I write when I'm inspired, so most of them take a couple of years. The next book I'll talk about, I can tell you took longer than that, because I specifically recall.
Okay. What else do we have here?
Apartheid in Indian Country, Seeing Red Over Black Disenfranchisement, is a book about people of African ancestry who lived among the 5 civilized tribes. Of course, the 5 civilized tribes are the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Cherokee. Many people in the United States, many people here in Oklahoma, don't understand that the so-called 5 civilized tribes all, to one degree or another, held people of African ancestry as slaves.
Mm-hmm.
There were also free people of African ancestry living among these tribes. The 5 tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. The Confederacy lost the Civil War. So the United States, the federal government, negotiated treaties with the 5 civilized tribes. Part of the provisions of those treaties included a pledge by the tribes, with the exceptions of the Chickasaws, that they would adopt their freedmen. They would adopt their persons of African ancestry who had formerly been enslaved as citizens of the tribes. Tribes are political entities. Tribes are not racial groups, they're political entities.
What do you mean?
So that was a political solution.
Okay.
So to be a member of the tribe means to be a member of a political entity, like to be a citizen of the United States, for example. And they use the term citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
The Chickasaws were the only tribe among the 5 tribes not to adopt their formerly enslaved persons of African ancestry. And as a result of that, we had people of African ancestry who were stateless after the Civil War. They didn't belong to the Chickasaw Nation, but they weren't citizens of the United States either, which is almost an unimaginable result that prevailed for several
So what did they do? What happened to them?
They ultimately, the Native American tribes and all Indians who had otherwise had not yet become citizens of the United States were granted citizenship in, I believe it's 1925. So ultimately they gained citizenship through acts of Congress.
So they gained citizenship to the United States of America, but
Right.
not necessarily the tribe.
Right, right. So the controversy today has to do with the descendants of those people who were called freedmen, the descendants of those people who were enslaved by the five tribes, and their continued right to citizenship. Some of the tribes, including the Cherokee Nation most notoriously, are contesting the right of the freedmen to be citizens of the tribe. And so, but the freedmen argue persuasively that the treaty, the post-Civil War treaty signed with the Cherokee Nation in 1866, is still valid, and it is. The treaty is valid until it's abrogated by Congress, and it hasn't been abrogated. So, the status of the Cherokee freedmen is in litigation in federal court today. But that whole history is remarkable because the whole determination of who is a freedman is also a matter of controversy, because when the federal government decided to break up the five civilized tribes, remember these tribes were tribes that held land in common. They didn't hold individual parcels of land. Mm-hmm. When the federal government decided to break up the tribes in the early part of the 20th century, they created what's called the Dawes Commission. And the Dawes Commission was responsible for what's called Indian allotment. So they came down, took surveys and censuses of the tribes, and parceled out tribal land in Indian territory to individual Indians. Mm-hmm. Well, the Dawes agents, when they were doing these censuses of the various tribes, they were a product of the racial times in which they lived. So these were people who were racist in the strictest sense of the term, meaning a feeling of white superiority and the power to impose that feeling on other individuals. Mm-hmm. So they took these census data from the tribes. When people came in to be registered for the allotment census, if the person to be registered had African features or African physiognomy, the Dawes agents would put them on what's called a freedman roll, essentially a black roll. Mm-hmm. If the person to be registered did not have such obvious apparent physical features of Africanness, then they were put on what's called the blood roll, and the Dawes agents would ask them and determine how much Indian blood or direct Indian ancestry that person had. So, if you happen to be a black person, a person of African ancestry who also has Indian blood or direct Indian lineage, you didn't get to tell the agent how much Indian blood you had. You were considered black. Mm. It's the one drop rule, or the rule of hypodescent. If you had any African ancestry, you're considered black, and you're on the freedman roll. So a number of people of African ancestry, perhaps you included, mm-hmm. who have Indian blood, of direct Indian genetic ancestry, mm-hmm. they're not able to prove that because they're on this freedman roll. And a lot of things, like the federal government, for example, issues a card called the Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood. Well, it references the Dawes rolls, the Dawes blood rolls. So not only the federal government to some extent, but some of the tribes, like the Cherokee, have begun to use the Dawes blood roll to determine who is a citizen. Well, that leaves out a lot of black folk, mm-hmm. whose names and their ancestors' name appear on the freedman roll. So it essentially says you're not a real Indian unless you're on the Indian blood roll that the Dawes agents constructed. Well, the Dawes agents were racist, and they constructed a roll for black people that discounted any Indian ancestry. So that's a problem, obviously.
Mm-hmm. So it was a no-win scenario.
Right, for some people.
Mm-hmm. Black people. Apartheid in Indian country, how did you come about that name?
It couldn't be more fitting. I mean, the attorney for the Cherokee freedmen, in a speech, used that term apartheid, which is a really loaded term. It's really blunt, it's direct, and it's highly confrontational. But it's appropriate in this context because apartheid really refers to separation of the races, and that's essentially what the Dawes Commission did, and what the Cherokees have tried to do by essentially disenfranchising the freedmen. Mm-hmm. And Indian country, Oklahoma, what's now Oklahoma, was Indian country. And later, in 1889, when part of Oklahoma, the western part, was opened up for settlement, it became what's called Oklahoma Territory. We had the twin territories, Oklahoma Territory to the west, Indian Territory to the east. And at statehood in 1907, those twin territories merged, but Indian Territory is kind of a common reference for this part of the country. And interestingly enough, to just give you kind of a metaphor for the racial dynamics that existed among European Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans. When Oklahoma became a state, one of the ceremonial events was the joining in marriage as a ritual of a Native American woman and a white man to signal the unification of Oklahoma and Indian Territory. Where are the black people in that picture? It's telling black people that they are essentially non-entities in Oklahoma, right? So, and that plays out in really dramatic ways because we know that just a few years after statehood, there were a number of lynchings in Oklahoma, the most prominent of which was probably the lynching of Laura Nelson and her son in Okemah. But racial hostility, racial segregation followed directly on the heels of the unification of Oklahoma and Indian Territory into the state of Oklahoma in 1907.
I noticed on the cover you have, I don't know who did the artwork, but you have some symbols there. They sort of resemble Adinkra symbols. Do you know what that's about?
I don't. But I think part of the beauty of the cover is that the designer of this imprint here on the cover created something that one's mind can project pretty much anything. I mean, some people, when they see that, will see kind of a native kind of stitchwork pattern. Mm-hmm. Some people might see some sort of higher symbolic message there. So I think it's subject to a number of interpretations, and I don't know what the interpretation of the designer is.
And that's as is the case with art in general.
Right.
We have a couple of minutes left. Is there any of you have another book here that you want to talk about? Is that it?
I think we'll just talk about this one. And this book, by the way, is available as well on Amazon.com. So I encourage people to pick it up. It's fascinating history.
Powerful.
Yeah, these are the ones I want to talk about. So, did you want to?
Let's get them all again.
You want them together or separate?
No, that's fine. What you have there is fine. I'll go down and get them all. And all of them are available online at Amazon.com or bookstores near you, or where can they get them?
These three are available on Amazon.com for sure. This one, the latest book, is actually available at ArcadiaPublishing.com. It may be on Amazon as well, but Arcadia Publishing has their own web presence, and that's where I direct people to.
Okay. I want to thank you for the time you've shared with us today, Brother Hannibal. This is powerful and interesting, informative, and necessary. I wanted to thank you again for giving us your time and the space of that magnificent brain of yours, brother. Thanks, man. I appreciate you.
All right, great.
Peace.
Thank you.